Welcome, everyone, to Easy History Podcast.
Great to be here.
Today, we're embarking on a deep dive into France during World War I, specifically its experience on the Western Front. It's quite a story.
It really is a tumultuous period, to say the least.
We're going to explore why France got into the war in the first place, the huge battles, what life was like for ordinary people.
The alliances, too, crucial. And the impact, the long-term impact.
Exactly. Ready to really understand one of the most intense chapters in French history?
Let's dive in.
Okay, so where do we start? To really get why France was involved, we need to go back a bit, right?
Absolutely. You have to look at the Franco-Prussian War. 1870-71. That defeat, It was a shock.
And France lost territory, didn't it?
Yes, Alsace and Lorraine.
Yeah.
Gone. To the newly formed Germany. And that loss, it left this deep scar.
Resentment.
Huge resentment, and this powerful desire for revenge, for getting those territories back. They called it la revanche.
La revanche. So it wasn't just history, it was a feeling, a national mood.
Oh, definitely. It shaped French politics, society, how they saw Germany. For decades leading up to 1914, it was always there, simmering.
Okay, so that's one major factor. But France wasn't just sitting there resentful, right? They were making alliances.
Precisely. They knew they needed security in a pretty tense Europe. By the early 1900s, France was a key part of the Triple Entente.
Right, that's with Great Britain and Russia.
Exactly. Think of it as a kind of mutual defense pact. If one was attacked, the others were, in theory, supposed to help.
And that whole system, that's what gets triggered in 1914.
That's the mechanism. When Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia after the Archduke's assassination, that's the spark.
The famous spark.
Right. And this web of alliances starts pulling everyone in. Germany backs Austria-Hungary, starts mobilizing.
And France.
France is tied to Russia by their treaty. So when Russia mobilizes, France has to follow suit. Just escalates incredibly fast. Shows how interconnected and maybe fragile everything was.
So it wasn't just Sarajevo, it was this whole structure underneath ready to collapse.
Exactly. The assassination lit the fuse, but the powder keg was already there. The alliances, the resentment, the arms race.
Then come the actual declarations of war.
Yes. August 3rd, 1914. Germany declares war on France, but things were already moving.
How so?
The German military plan, the Schlieffen Plan, was already in motion. The very next day, August 4th, German troops invade Belgium.
Neutral Belgium.
Neutral Belgium. That was key to their plan. Go around the main French border defenses, attack from the north.
And that invasion of Belgium, that's really the start of the Western Front.
That's the moment. It brings Britain into the war immediately, too, because they guaranteed Belgian neutrality. So now you have the major players locked in on this Western Front.
And France had its own plan, didn't it? Plan a 7th, I think? What was that about?
Plan to 7th, yes. That was the French pre-war strategy. It was all about offense. A quick, powerful push straight into Alsace and Lorraine.
Back to La Revanche. Retake the lost lands.
Precisely. There was this strong belief in the French military in the power of offensive spirit. Elan, they called it.
But it didn't quite work out like that.
Not at all. It failed pretty quickly. It underestimated the German defenses, and more importantly, it completely failed to anticipate the sheer speed and scale of the German attack through Belgium.
So France was planning for one kind of war.
And got another. Plan Act 7th basically fell apart in the opening weeks, leading to heavy French losses and a rapid retreat.
While the Germans were enacting their Schlieffen Plan, that massive flanking move through Belgium, aiming for Paris.
Exactly. Sweep down and circle Paris, knock France out fast, maybe 6 weeks. That was the idea. Deal with France before Russia could fully mobilize its huge army in the east.
Avoid a two-front war.
That was the dream for Germany. But it sets the stage for the first huge clash, the Battle of the Marne.
September 1914, just outside Paris. Why is the Marne considered such a turning point?
Because it stopped them. It stopped the German advance cold. The French and British forces, they managed to regroup, coordinate, and halt the Germans just east of Paris.
How? Weren't the Germans winning up to that point?
They were advancing, yes, but very fast. Their supply lines were stretched thin. They faced tougher resistance than expected, especially from the Belgians initially and then the French.
And didn't Paris taxis get involved?
Famously, yes. The French rushed reinforcements to the front using Parisian taxis. A bit desperate, maybe, but symbolic of the national effort.
So the Allies held.
They held. And that victory was massive. It shattered the Schlieffen Plan's goal of a quick victory. It meant the war wasn't going to be short. It was going to be long and bloody.
And that failure, that stalemate at the Marne, leads directly to trench warfare.
Directly. Neither side could outflank the other anymore. The front stabilized. Both armies literally dug in for protection.
Creating those lines of trenches we always see pictures of.
Exactly. Miles and miles of them.
Yeah.
From the English Channel down to Switzerland. This intricate, deadly network.
And that changes everything.
Completely. Offensives become incredibly costly. Gaining even a few hundred yards could cost thousands of lives. It becomes this brutal war of attrition, just trying to wear the other side down.
Horrifying. And within that trench system, you get these iconic, terrible battles. Verdun, for instance, 1916.
Verdun,
Yeah.
a name synonymous with the horror. It was one of the longest, bloodiest battles in history.
What was the German aim there? Why Verdun?
German Chief of Staff, Falkenhayn, his explicit goal was, quote, to bleed France white.
Bleed France white. Chilling.
It is. They chose Verdun because it was historically significant to France, heavily fortified. They calculated the French would defend it at any cost.
So it wasn't about capturing the place itself necessarily?
Not primarily. It was about forcing the French army into a meat grinder,
Right.
inflicting such massive casualties that French morale would break. A battle of annihilation.
And how did France they had to defend it, right?
They did. Under General Pétain initially, his famous line was, Ils ne passeront pas. They shall not pass.
And they didn't?
They didn't pass. But the cost, unbelievable. The battle raged for 10 months. Non-stop artillery, gas attacks, brutal fighting.
Suspense.
10 months. Over 700,000 casualties killed or wounded French and German combined in that one relatively small area.
Just staggering numbers.
It's almost impossible to grasp, but France held. Verdun became this powerful symbol of French resistance, but also of the sheer industrial scale of killing in this war.
And while Verdun was raging, the Allies launched another huge offensive, right? The Somme.
Yes, the Battle of the Somme started July 1st, 1916, a joint British and French operation.
What was the goal there?
Two main goals, really. One, to try and relieve the immense pressure on the French at Verdun by drawing German troops away.
Okay, makes sense.
And two, to actually try and achieve a breakthrough, punch a hole in the German lines.
The French were involved alongside the British.
Yes, particularly on the southern part of the Somme front. But the Somme is probably most remembered for the British experience, especially that catastrophic first day.
Huge losses.
Colossal losses on both sides, British, French, German. The preliminary bombardment, meant to destroy German defenses, largely failed. The attackers advanced into machine gun fire. Minimal gains, immense casualties.
Another example of the stalemate.
A brutal example. It just hammered home how difficult, how costly it was to break the trench deadlock with the tactics and technology of the time.
It's hard to fathom this level of destruction happening, and mostly on French soil. What did that mean for civilians?
That's a crucial point. Unlike Britain or Germany, much of the fighting, the destruction, was in France. Northern and eastern France were devastated.
Towns, villages just wiped out.
Completely. And infrastructure, roads, railways, farms. Millions of French civilians became refugees in their own country, fleeing the fighting. Imagine the trauma.
And even away from the front lines, life must have changed dramatically. Total war, right?
Total war, exactly. The whole economy shifted. Factories stopped making normal goods and started churning out weapons, ammunition, uniforms, everything the army needed.
And with so many men at the front.
Women stepped in, massively. They took jobs in factories, munitions plants, drove trams, worked on farms, served as nurses. It was a huge social shift.
Did that last after the war?
To some extent, yes. It definitely changed perceptions and opened doors, though there was also pressure for things to return to normal afterwards. But it planted a seed.
In day-to-day life, supplies must have been tight.
Oh yes, rationing became essential. Bread, sugar, cold key things were limited. People had to make do, sacrifice. It created hardship, but maybe also a sense of shared effort.
And the government must have been working hard to keep spirits up. Propaganda.
Absolutely. Posters everywhere, encouraging people to work hard, save food, buy war bonds to fund the fighting, lots of patriotic messaging, demonizing the enemy. Keeping morale high was critical.
But could that morale last indefinitely after years of this carnage and hardship?
It became incredibly difficult. By 1917, after Verdun, the Somme, the failed Nivelle offensive, war weariness was setting in deep.
For soldiers and civilians.
Both. Soldiers in the trenches endured horrific conditions. Constant danger, mud, disease, the psychological strain. It was immense.
And that led to problems?
Yes, 1917 saw widespread mutinies in the French army, not necessarily refusing to defend, but refusing to go on pointless, suicidal offensives. Soldiers had just had enough.
How did the government handle that? That sounds critical.
Very carefully, General Pétain, who took command, managed to restore order partly through promises of better conditions, fewer large-scale attacks, and partly through discipline, including executions. But it showed how close things were to breaking. Civilians were weary too, strikes increased, discontent grew.
So, facing this internal strain, France really needed its allies, Britain, obviously, but then the U.S. enters the war.
That was absolutely pivotal. The alliance with Britain was crucial from day one, sharing the burden on the Western Front. Sometimes coordination wasn't perfect, but British manpower and resources were essential.
But the U.S. joining in 1917, that must have felt like a lifeline.
A massive lifeline. April 1917 was a huge boost, psychologically and materially.
How so?
Well, first, fresh troops. The doughboys, as they were called. They weren't yet worn down by years of trench warfare.
Right, reinforcements.
And not just men. American industry was enormous. They brought vast resources, money, equipment, supplies. It tipped the balance, materially.
And their impact on the fighting.
They played a key role, especially in 1918, helping to stop the final big German offensives. Germany knew American power was growing, so they launched these desperate attacks to try and win before the U.S. could fully deploy.
But they failed.
They failed. Allied forces, bolstered by the Americans, held the line and then began to push back. The arrival of the Americans just injected this renewed hope and energy when the Allies were exhausted.
And eventually the Allies coordinated their final pushes under one commander.
Yes, French Marshal Ferdinand Foch was appointed Supreme Allied Commander in the spring of 1918. That unified command helped coordinate the offensives across the Western Front that finally broke the German army's resistance.
Leading to the Armistice, November 11th, 1918. The fighting stops.
The fighting stops. France survived. It was on the winning side. But the cost?
Imagine.
Truly, over 1.3 million French soldiers dead. More than 4 million wounded, many maimed for life. Entire regions physically destroyed. The demographic impact, losing so many young men, was felt for generations.
A victory bought at a terrible price. But there was one major gain they'd wanted for so long.
Alsace and Lorraine, yes, they got them back. That was hugely significant, symbolically and emotionally, fulfilling that goal of La Revanche that had simmered since 1871, a moment of real national satisfaction amidst the grief.
Then came the peace treaty, Versailles, 1919, and the French Prime Minister Clemenceau, he had strong ideas about what needed to happen.
Georges Clemenceau, the Tiger. He'd seen Germany invade France twice in his lifetime. His absolute priority was French security. He wanted to make sure Germany could never, ever do it again.
So he pushed for harsh terms?
Extremely harsh terms. Huge reparations, payments to cover war damages, strict limits on the German military, territorial losses for Germany, the infamous war guilt clause.
To keep Germany weak?
Essentially, yes. To cripple Germany economically and militarily so it couldn't pose a future threat. Understandable from his perspective, given France's suffering.
Yeah.
But those harsh terms created enormous resentment in Germany. A sense of humiliation and injustice. And historians argue that this resentment, tragically, helped pave the way for extremism later on.
The rise of Nazism and eventually World War II.
It's certainly seen as a contributing factor. The peace settlement, meant to prevent war, inadvertently sowed the seeds for the next one.
So looking back, the First World War just completely reshaped France.
Profoundly. La Grande Guerre, the Great War, became etched into the national memory. The physical scars on the landscape, the economic rebuilding needed, the emotional trauma.
And those war memorials everywhere in France.
In every single town and village, practically. Listing the names. A constant reminder of the sacrifice. It unified the nation in grief, but also left this deep trauma.
And socially, we mentioned women's roles changing.
Yes, that shift continued. The need for economic reconstruction dominated the post-war years. There was national unity, but also exhaustion. France was victorious, yes, but weakened, drained.
Victorious but exhausted, and facing an uncertain future, even with Germany defeated for the moment.
Exactly. The stage was set, unfortunately, for more conflict just 2 decades down the line. The echoes of the Great War were long and deep.
A powerful legacy indeed. Well, thank you for guiding us through this deep dive into France's role in World War I. It's a lot to take in.
It certainly is a defining moment for France and the world. Thanks for the discussion.